My name is Abby Free. Today is April 21st of 2021, and this is my presentation on the regulation of the gastric phase. So today I'm going to talk about the regulation of the gastric phase in digestion. And to start, I'm going to talk about a little bit of background information about the gastric phase. So the gastric phase is the phase of digestion in the stomach that follows activity of mastication and swallowing of the food. So this occurs when the food actually enters the stomach. How does digested food actually stimulate this activity? Well, there are really three ways that this can happen. One of them is the stretching of the stomach, which will activate one of two or both reflexes. One is the short reflex, which is the enteric nervous system, and the other one is the long reflex, which is the stimulation from the vagus nerve and the brainstem, and that is a parasympathetic nervous system pathway. And then the third one is a rise in the pH of the contents within the stomach. Next, I want to talk about an important anatomical feature of the stomach that is very prominent within the gastric phase. That would be the gastric pits. The gastric pits are openings in the lumen of the stomach that are lined by mucus-producing epithelium and various other cells within what's called the gastric gland. The gastric gland is deep within the gastric pits. So in the picture on the screen here, you can see that it begins about halfway down the pit. It's all of these extra cells down here. The cells that are included in the gastric gland will produce the stomach acid, hormones, enzymes, and then various paracrine molecules that get secreted into the stomach and help the food get digested so that it can be moved along to the small intestine. The first secretion I want to talk about is the secretion of gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone that is secreted by G cells. The secretion of gastrin can be stimulated really in three ways. The first one is the presence of amino acids in the stomach or the distension of the stomach. Those two kind of go hand in hand because if there's food in the stomach, it'll cause that distension, which is the stretching of the stomach. But that food contains those amino acids, so they kind of mean the same thing. The third way would be the neural reflexes, which we talked about above. That's going to be the short reflex and the long reflex. The long reflex is also known as the cephalic reflex. The short reflex is the enteric nervous system, and it is when the enteric nervous system releases the neurotransmitter gastrin-releasing peptide. That gastrin-releasing peptide will allow the gastrin to be secreted from the G cells. For the cephalic reflex, again, it's going to be that parasympathetic neuron pathway via the vagus nerve. The cephalic reflex begins during the cephalic phase, and that is really the preparation to eat food and then the actual chewing of food. So when the cephalic phase is occurring, the cephalic reflex kind of prepares the stomach that the food is coming, and that's why you see that release of gastrin. The secretion of gastrin will initiate the cascading effect of the release of a bunch of other secretions into the stomach through various different cells. That can be seen in the diagram on the right here. So next I will go over the various different cells and secretions that also get secreted in the stomach. The next secretion is the secretion of acid within the stomach. Stomach acid is actually called gastric acid, and it is a hydrochloric acid. It plays many roles during the gastric phase of digestion in the stomach, so it is very important. The first thing that it does is it will release and activate the enzyme known as pepsin. It will also trigger somatostatin from the D cells, which is super important, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It'll denature proteins in the stomach to aid in the digestion process, and it'll help kill any bacteria, microbes, or anything from the exterior environment that gets into the stomach that's not supposed to be there. The next category of secretions I'm going to talk about is the secretion of enzymes within the stomach. There are two main enzymes that take place during the gastric phase. The first one is pepsin, and the second one is gastric lipase. Pepsin is secreted as an inactive enzyme, which is known as pepsinogen, and pepsinogen is secreted by chief cells. As we kind of talked about in the last slide, It is that gastric acid that initiates the secretion of that pepsinogen, and it'll actually then go and cleave it to the active form of the enzyme, which is pepsin. So pepsin is the active form. That is the one that actually does the initial digestion of the proteins in the stomach. That is why it's super important for us to have pepsin in the stomach, because we need those proteins to start getting digested early on, so that it's easier for the small intestine to absorb everything it needs to. The second enzyme is gastric lipase. This is co-secreted from the chief cells along with pepsin, so it means that it's also initiated by that gastric acid, just like the pepsin was. And gastric lipase is important because it helps to digest the fats within the stomach. So again, it gets everything going so that once the food gets into the small intestine can absorb those nutrients that it needs to keep the body moving. The last category of secretions I'm going to talk about are the paracrine secretions. So as we've learned in previous units, paracrine secretion is a secretion that occurs locally, and then it will also act on a target that is local. So it is considered a local signaling molecule. There are three main paracrine secretions that occur in the stomach. We have histamine, intrinsic factor, and somatostatin. I'm going to start with histamine. So histamine is a hormone secreted by the enterochromaffin-like cells. This will be in response to gastrin or acetylcholine. The target cell of the histamine is the parietal cells, and that is to initiate that acid secretion. The next paracrine secretion is intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is actually a protein that gets secreted by parietal cells. And intrinsic factor is super important because it will create a B12 complex, which allows the body to absorb that vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is super important in various different mechanisms throughout the body. So intrinsic factor is super important so that we can keep our systems within our body healthy via that B12. Somatostatin is the last one. This is a hormone that is secreted by D cells. This is a super important hormone that needs to be secreted in the stomach, and I did kind of mention that earlier when we were talking about the acid. It is the primary negative feedback signal within the stomach. So it will actually go through and inhibit the secretion of acid, gastrin, and the histamine secretions. So it is the driving force behind that negative feedback loop that occurs once the stomach is empty and we no longer need all these secretions occurring. So if we didn't have the somatostatin, the secretions of all these things would continue all the time, which we wouldn't want. We want our body to be efficient and only do stuff when it needs to. So the somatostatin will inhibit the secretion of all those things once it's no longer needed. So now that we've gone through all the different categories of the secretions that occur in the stomach, how those secretions begin, and kind of what each of those secretions do, I do want to wrap everything up using this wonderful diagram from our textbook. It kind of just puts everything I talked to in one picture, so it's a little bit easier to understand. So the process begins when the food enters the stomach. So it's those amino acids or peptides that will stimulate the enteric nervous system to begin the process by stimulating the G cell to release that gastrin. Like we also talked about, the neural reflexes can also cause the gastrin to be stimulated. So you can see input via that vagus nerve will also stimulate the G cell and begin the secretion of gastrin. Once gastrin is secreted, it's going to stimulate the ECL cell and the parietal cells to begin releasing their secretions. The ECL cell is the one that releases that hormone histamine, which will also cause the parietal cell to release more acid. So the gastric acid will be released by the parietal cell, and like I said, that is stimulated both by the histamine release from the ECL cell and the release of gastrin. It is also stimulated by that vagus nerve. So we have a lot of things that play into that parietal cell releasing the acid. That's because that acid is super important within the stomach. Once we get that release of gastric acid, that will lead to the release of pepsinogen from the chief cell. And remember, pepsinogen is the inactive form of the enzyme pepsin. it is actually going to also be that gastric acid that causes the pepsinogen to go from pepsinogen to pepsin, and pepsin is the active form of that enzyme. Then we go back up to the D cell. The acid is also going to stimulate the D cells to start releasing that hormone somatostatin. As we talked about, somatostatin is the inhibitor that is the thing that turns off all of these secretions within the stomach. So it is the one that drives that negative feedback loop so that we don't have constant secretion in the stomach when it's not necessary. All of this information came from our textbook in Human Physiology by Silverthorne. And that is the end of my presentation.